In a quiet part of the city, there lived a man who ever. James stood still, feeling the weight of the moment. The young men were laughing, their words sharp and full of mockery. The air around them felt thick, as if the world had slowed down. James knew things were about to get worse, but he didn't move. He wasn't afraid, but he also knew better than to let his emotions take over. His calmness, however, didn't stop the group from closing in on him. One of the men, a taller figure with a deep voice, took a step forward, clearly eager for confrontation. "You think you can ignore us, huh?" He sneered, his fists clenched. James could feel the anger building up in the group, but he kept his posture relaxed, hoping to avoid any real conflict. "Look, I don't want any trouble," James said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm just trying to get home. That's all." But the group didn't seem interested in peace. The man who had first approached him stepped even closer now, practically pushing his chest against James. He was trying to intimidate him, hoping to break his composure. But James had seen it all before. Without warning, the young man shoved James hard. It wasn't a powerful push, but it was enough to make him lose his balance for a moment. He staggered, his feet barely managing to stay planted. The group laughed, egging each other on. The man who had shoved James took another step forward, raising his voice. "What's wrong, old man? Can't take a little push?" James's heart raced, but he refused to let them see it. Instead, he stood his ground. He knew that any reaction, any show of weakness, would only make things worse. He took a deep breath and steadied himself, aware of the anger rising inside the group. They weren't backing off. They were getting more aggressive. The group was closing in around him, but James wasn't about to let them force him into a corner. He knew how to stay calm in these situations, how to avoid unnecessary violence. He'd been trained for years to handle pressure, to control his emotions. But this time, it felt different. The group wasn't just teasing him. They were trying to provoke him, to push him into a fight. The man who had shoved him earlier looked at his friends, then back at James, as if waiting for him to react. When James didn't, the man took another step forward, this time raising his hand as if to strike. That was the moment James knew he couldn't just stand there anymore. He had to act. In the blink of an eye, the young man lunged forward, his fist aimed at James's face. But James was ready. His years of training kicked in without him even thinking. In one fluid motion, he dodged to the side, avoiding the punch by inches. The young man stumbled forward, off balance, and that's when James moved. With a quick, well-practiced movement, James grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it, causing him to cry out in surprise. James didn't use full force. He was simply aiming to disarm the attacker and end the situation before it could escalate further. The man tried to fight back, but James held him in place, his calm demeanor showing that he had control of the situation. The others were shocked. They had expected James to be easy prey, someone they could intimidate and push around. But now, they saw something completely different. James wasn't just some ordinary guy. He was someone who knew exactly how to handle himself. The realization hit them like a cold wave. The rest of the gang hesitated, unsure of what to do. One of the men stepped forward, a bit more cautious now, but still filled with bravado. "Let him go," he demanded. "He doesn't want any trouble." But James didn't release the man just yet. He held his position, waiting to see what the others would do. He wasn't going to let them think they could get away with bullying him. His calm demeanor remained, but his grip on the young man's wrist didn't loosen. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but he wasn't about to back down either. "Listen," James said quietly, his voice firm but not raised. "You all need to leave. Now, before things get worse for you." The tension was thick in the air. The gang members looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. James's calm strength had caught them off guard, and for a brief moment they realized they weren't in control anymore. They had underestimated him, thinking he was weak, thinking he wouldn't fight back. James watched as the gang members slowly backed away, their eyes still filled with disbelief. The air was thick with tension, but he didn't let his guard down. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had acted on instinct, his MMA training kicking in without him even thinking. He had avoided a bigger fight, but he knew this wasn't over. The group might have left for now, but he could sense they were still watching, waiting for another chance. As James continued walking home, his thoughts drifted back to his time in the MMA world. It felt like a lifetime ago, and in many ways, it was. Back then, he had been a champion, one of the best in the sport. He had faced opponents from all over the world, each one more challenging than the last. But now those days felt distant, like a chapter in his life that had already closed. James hadn't wanted to leave the fighting world, but over the years, the wear and tear on his body had become too much to ignore. His knees ached, his back was stiff, and his hands, once powerful weapons in the ring, were no longer as fast or precise as they used to be. He had spent years in the gym, training relentlessly to stay at the top. But as time went on, the fights had started to take a toll. His career had come to an end, and with it, so had the attention. The crowds, the media, the fame, all of it was gone. He was just another man, walking home from work. But deep down, James knew he hadn't really left the fighter in him behind. The skills he had learned, the focus, the control, it was all still there. He didn't need to step into a ring to know he could still defend himself. The movement, the speed, the instinct, everything was just as sharp as it had been in his prime. The truth was, he hadn't forgotten how to fight. It was just a part of him now, buried beneath the layers of normal life. As James entered his apartment, he closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, breathing deeply. He felt the adrenaline still coursing through his body, but it was starting to fade. His hands were shaking slightly, but he wasn't scared, just tired. He had never wanted to be the type of person who used violence to solve problems. He had learned long ago that there were always better ways to handle things. But tonight, he had been pushed to the edge. And though he hadn't started the fight, he had finished it. The events from earlier kept replaying in his mind. He had handled himself well, no doubt about it. The gang had tried to push him around, to intimidate him, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. To them, he was just a big man who looked like an easy target. They didn't know about his past, his history, the battles he had fought in the ring. They didn't know that beneath the layers of age and weight, there was still a fighter waiting to emerge when necessary. But as James sat down on his couch, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He hadn't wanted this. He didn't want to live in the past, to constantly be reminded of the battles he had fought, whether in the ring or on the streets. He wanted peace. He wanted a normal life. And yet tonight had shown him something he had tried to forget. That no matter how much he tried to bury his past, it was still a part of him. He couldn't change it. The skills, the instincts, they were always going to be there. James glanced at the clock. It was late, and he had work tomorrow. But sleep wasn't coming easily. His mind was still sharp, the events of the evening lingering in the back of his thoughts. He had acted without hesitation, and in doing so, had shown himself that the fire inside him was far from gone. But now, as he sat in his quiet apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time he'd be tested. For now, James decided to rest. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come immediately. His mind kept drifting back to that group of young men, and how, for just a moment, he had been forced to be the fighter again. He couldn't help but wonder if they would return. And if they did, would he be ready to fight once more? James had no answers, but one thing was clear: no matter what, he would always be ready. The warrior inside him was still very much alive. The next morning, James woke up early. His body still ached from the adrenaline of the previous night, but there was something else weighing on him. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the unease that had settled deep in his chest. The events of yesterday felt like they had left a mark on him, something he couldn't easily shake off. It was as if the past had resurfaced, knocking at his door, reminding him that the fighter inside was still very much alive. Despite the unease, James got ready for work, making his usual cup of coffee and eating a quick breakfast. He tried to focus on the normalcy of his routine. The job he had, the quiet life he had built for himself, it was all supposed to be simple. But as he dressed, he couldn't help but think back to the moment when the gang had surrounded him. He had acted without hesitation, his training taking over, and in the blink of an eye, he had defended himself. The shock in their faces had been clear. They hadn't expected a man of his size to move so quickly or handle the situation with such skill. They had thought they were dealing with an easy target, but they were wrong. As James walked out the door and into the crisp morning air, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would the gang come after him again? He hoped not, but deep down, he knew there was a possibility. He had made a mark on them, and people like that didn't forget easily. Still, he tried to push the thoughts aside and focus on the day ahead. He had to stay grounded, keep his life on track, and not let fear take hold of him. The walk to work was quiet. The city had woken up, but it felt different today. James felt like a shadow among the crowd, moving through the streets with no one noticing. People were going about their business, lost in their own worlds, but he couldn't help but feel out of place. For the first time in years, he felt as if his past might be catching up with him. His mind kept replaying the scene from last night, how the gang had backed off, how he had surprised them with his control and skill. But as proud as he was of how he had handled the situation, there was still a nagging feeling that something more was coming. At work, James tried to keep a low profile. He didn't want to talk about what had happened. The last thing he wanted was to attract attention. He had spent so long building a new life for himself, one that didn't involve violence, fame, or the world of fighting. But he couldn't ignore the fact that something had shifted. The fight with the gang, while brief, had reminded him of who he was underneath the layers of age and weight. He hadn't just been the retired champion he thought he was. There was still a fighter in him, and it was not something he could easily hide. As the hours passed, James's thoughts kept returning to the encounter. He kept wondering whether the gang would come after him again. He had made his point. He had defended himself, and they had left. But was that the end of it, or was there more to come? James knew that sometimes people like the ones he had faced weren't easily discouraged. He couldn't let his guard down, not completely. But he also realized something important. He hadn't just been defending himself. He had proven to himself that the skills he had worked so hard to develop hadn't disappeared. They were still there, still a part of him, even if he had tried to forget them. The fighter inside had been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And now that he had been reminded of his strength, James wasn't sure if he could go back to being the quiet, ordinary man he had been before. By the time the workday ended, James was exhausted, not from physical effort, but from the weight of his own thoughts. He walked home that evening, his steps slower than usual. The streets seemed quieter tonight, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface. The world was a little different now. The fight from the night before had opened a door he wasn't sure he was ready to walk through. The sun had barely risen the next morning when James received an unexpected visit. His phone rang, breaking the stillness of his apartment. The screen flashed with a local police number. He hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of what this call might mean. "Hello," James said, trying to sound calm despite the rising feeling in his chest. "Mr. Harris, this is Officer Daniels from the 5th Precinct. I'm calling about an incident last night. We're conducting an investigation, and we'd like to hear your side of the story." James paused. His mind immediately went back to the altercation with the gang. He had hoped that would be the end of it, but clearly, the situation had escalated further. The officer's voice was steady, but there was an urgency in his tone. "Is everything okay?" James asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "We'd like to ask you to come down to the station for a few minutes. It's about the altercation you were involved in last night. Some of the young men involved have made statements, and we need to clear up a few things." James felt a knot form in his stomach. He hadn't expected this. The gang had left, and he thought the problem was over. But now he realized that the situation was far from finished. The police were involved, and they were asking for his side of the story. He knew he needed to go to the station and cooperate, but he also knew that this wasn't going to be as simple as he had hoped. "I'll be there in an hour," James said, trying to keep his composure. He hung up the phone, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't how he had wanted his life to play out. He had worked so hard to leave his fighting days behind. Now, because of one altercation, he was once again being pulled into the world of confrontation. But this time, it wasn't in the ring. This time, it was on the streets, and it had nothing to do with sports. It was personal. James took a deep breath and left his apartment. He didn't know what to expect at the station, but he had to face it. The walk to the precinct was short, but as he approached the building, he couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a situation he hadn't asked for. The people from the gang had tried to bully him, and when they found out who he really was, they had backed off. But now, the police were involved, and he had to explain himself. At the station, James was led into a small interview room. Officer Daniels was waiting for him. The officer looked professional, his demeanor calm but firm. He motioned for James to sit down. "Mr. Harris, thank you for coming in. We're just trying to piece together what happened last night," Officer Daniels began. "The young men involved in the altercation have made some statements. They claim you attacked them without reason. However, witnesses say they were provoking you." James sighed, feeling the weight of the situation. "They started it," he explained, trying to keep things simple. "They surrounded me, calling me names and pushing me. I tried to walk away, but they wouldn't let me." "I understand," Officer Daniels said, nodding. "But the thing is, one of the young men ended up in the hospital with a broken wrist. They're claiming you did it intentionally. Now, we're not accusing you, but we need to hear your side of the story." James wasn't surprised. The gang had been so full of bravado and anger that it made sense they would twist the truth to make themselves the victims. He had been calm throughout the whole encounter, and the only reason it had escalated was because they didn't stop. He had only acted to defend himself. "I didn't want any trouble," James said. "I just wanted to go home. But they wouldn't stop. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I only defended myself when they attacked me." The officer listened carefully, making notes as James spoke. "I believe you, Mr. Harris. We just need to follow the process. If you're willing, we'd like to hear your statement on record." James agreed, knowing that the sooner this was resolved, the better. He wasn't afraid of the police. He had nothing to hide. Still, there was a part of him that hated being pulled back into a situation that brought back memories of his past. But in that moment, he also realized something important. The past wasn't something he could run from. It was a part of him. The days that followed the incident felt like they stretched on forever for James. He kept going through his routine, trying to stay focused on his work and not think too much about what had happened. The call from the police and the visit to the station had been enough to keep him on edge, but life went on. He tried to push it all aside, until one afternoon when everything changed. James had just finished a long day at the office and was walking home when he noticed a small crowd gathered near his apartment building. His first instinct was to ignore it, but as he walked closer, he saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was Officer Daniels, the same officer who had spoken to him at the station. The officer was talking to a group of reporters, their cameras flashing as they snapped pictures. Curious, James approached cautiously, unsure of what was going on. He hadn't expected to be involved in any more public attention, but there it was. Officer Daniels noticed him and waved him over. "Mr. Harris, "Good to see you," the officer greeted with a smile. "I think it's time you know something." James raised an eyebrow, not sure what was happening. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low. Before Officer Daniels could respond, one of the reporters turned to James, a microphone in hand. "Mr. Harris," the reporter said eagerly, "can you confirm that you are the former MMA champion who was involved in an altercation with a gang of young men last week?" James froze. For a moment, he couldn't process what he was hearing. The words "former MMA champion" echoed in his mind. He hadn't been called that in years. He had left that part of his life behind. So why was it coming up now? Officer Daniels stepped forward, noticing James's confusion. "We didn't know who you were at first, Mr. Harris. After your statement, we dug a little deeper, and it turns out you have quite a history." The reporters caught wind of it, and now, well, the story's out there. James's heart raced as he tried to make sense of it all. He had never wanted to bring up his past. He didn't want to be reminded of the fame, the victories, or the attention. He had worked hard to leave it all behind. But now, it seemed his past was coming back to haunt him. "I didn't want this," James said quietly, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "I've moved on from that life." The reporter, sensing a story, didn't miss a beat. "But you're the same man who once fought in the ring and became a legend, right? How do you feel about that part of your life now?" James took a deep breath, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "That was a different time," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I don't want to talk about that. I'm just trying to live my life now. What happened last week was a simple act of self-defense, and that's all there is to it." The reporters and photographers were still buzzing with excitement, but James's mind was elsewhere. The world around him seemed to fade as he processed the reality of what was happening. He had always tried to keep his past a secret, but now it seemed impossible to escape it. The next few days were filled with stories about James's past. News outlets were running articles about the MMA champion who defended himself against a gang. His name was suddenly everywhere again. But this time, it wasn't for his fighting skills. It was because of an event that had almost turned violent, one that he had tried to forget. James didn't know how to feel. On the one hand, the attention made him uncomfortable. He had worked so hard to leave the ring behind. He didn't want to be remembered for his past fights. He wanted to be seen as just another person, living his life like everyone else. But at the same time, there was a part of him that couldn't deny the pride he felt. The old skills he had honed over years of training were still inside him, ready to be called upon when needed. He had proven to himself that, no matter how much time had passed, he could still handle himself. The fight with the gang wasn't just a defense of his body. It was a defense of everything he had worked so hard to build. It was a reminder that, no matter how far he had come, he would never truly escape who he was. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. As the attention from the media started to fade, James found himself at a crossroads. He wasn't sure where he was headed from here, but he knew that he had to face the future, whatever it held. The past might have caught up with him, but it didn't define him anymore. What mattered now was how he moved forward. James walked down the street, thinking about his next steps. The fight had reminded him of his strength, but it had also reminded him that the past was never far behind. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it head-on, just as he always had. As the days passed, the attention surrounding James's encounter with the gang slowly faded, but the ripple effects were far from over. While the media had moved on to other stories, the consequences of the altercation were still unfolding in other ways. The young men involved in the incident had not backed off, and now their actions were leading to even bigger consequences. James didn't hear from the gang again, and for a while he allowed himself to relax. He thought maybe they had learned their lesson. Maybe they realized that pushing people around wasn't as easy as they had thought. But as the week wore on, the reality of what had happened started to hit home. One morning, James was at work when he received an unexpected phone call. It was Officer Daniels again. The officer's tone was serious. "Mr. Harris, we need to speak with you again," Officer Daniels said. "There's been a development in the case. The young men involved in the altercation have been arrested. They're facing some serious charges, and we need your statement." James felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. He hadn't expected this. He had just defended himself. He never wanted to see anyone get arrested or face severe consequences. He didn't even know how much trouble the gang had gotten into. The police had never explained things in detail, but now it was clear that this wasn't just a minor fight anymore. "What do you mean?" James asked, trying to stay calm. "What happened?" "The gang members are being charged with harassment, attempted assault, and disturbing the peace. One of the men has also been charged with making false statements to the authorities," Officer Daniels explained. "We're just trying to get the full story, and your testimony is needed to finalize the case." James let out a deep breath. He never wanted it to go this far. The last thing he wanted was for the situation to escalate into legal trouble. He had hoped the matter would stay quiet and resolve itself, but now it seemed like the young men would face far more than just the embarrassment of losing a fight. He couldn't help but feel conflicted. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt," James said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "I just wanted to get away from them. I didn't mean for it to turn into a big deal." "I understand," Officer Daniels replied. "But from what we've gathered, these young men have been involved in similar incidents before. This isn't the first time they've caused trouble." James couldn't believe it. He hadn't known these men. He had thought they were just a group of troublemakers looking for a quick laugh, but now he learned that they had a history of this behavior. It didn't make him feel any better about the situation, but it did make him realize that he wasn't the only one affected by their actions. They had caused harm to others before, and now they were finally facing the consequences. Later that afternoon, James went to the police station once more. This time, the atmosphere was different. There were more officers involved, and everything felt more formal. He sat in the interview room once again, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was about to give his statement, but a part of him still felt like he was caught in a situation he never asked for. Officer Daniels greeted him with a nod. "Thanks for coming in, Mr. Harris. We just need your side of the story in more detail. It'll help wrap up the investigation." James gave his statement, explaining everything as best as he could. He recounted the events of the night, the gang's taunts, their physical push, and how he had acted only in self-defense. He knew he had to be honest, even though it made him uncomfortable. He had no reason to lie. His actions were clear. He had only defended himself from aggression. Once the interview was over, Officer Daniels thanked him again. "We'll be in touch if anything else comes up. But from here, it looks like the case is moving toward a close." Walking out of the police station, James felt a strange sense of relief. The matter was coming to an end, but it had changed him. He had been forced into a situation where he had to confront his past, his skills, and even his own feelings about violence and justice. He had acted out of instinct, but now he understood the consequences of that action. It wasn't just about protecting himself. It had a bigger impact on the people involved. James knew he wasn't the bad guy in the situation. He had simply reacted to a dangerous situation in the only way he knew how. But the fact that the gang members were facing serious consequences made him reflect on how quickly things could get out of control. One small action could snowball into something much bigger, and now he had to live with that. Months had passed since that tense night when James had been confronted by the gang. Life had returned to its usual pace, with the quiet hum of daily routine, but things felt different for him. The events that had unfolded, his past coming to light, the altercation, and the aftermath, had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. For the first time in a long while, James found himself reflecting on who he was and the person he was becoming. The media had mostly moved on, leaving James to quietly slip back into his normal life. The news about the gang had faded from the headlines, and James wasn't mentioned as much anymore. The world had quickly forgotten about him, and in many ways, he was glad. The attention had felt strange, almost uncomfortable. James had never been one for the spotlight, and he certainly didn't want it now. He still worked his regular job, still lived in his small apartment. There were no more visits from the police, no more reporters knocking on his door. The gang members who had once threatened him were now out of the picture, having faced the consequences of their actions. He had defended himself, and now things seemed to be quiet again. But even though things were calm on the surface, James knew something had changed within him. As he sat in his apartment one evening, sipping a cup of coffee, he thought about his past, about his years as an MMA champion. It felt so distant, almost like a dream. He had put so much effort into becoming the best, into training relentlessly and fighting in front of thousands of fans. The rush of victory, the joy of the crowd cheering for him. He missed it sometimes, but the toll it had taken on his body, the pain that followed each fight, was a constant reminder of why he had walked away. Now he lived a simpler life, one where he could walk down the street without drawing attention. And while he didn't miss the pain of competition, there were moments when he missed the feeling of being needed, of knowing that he could make a difference just by stepping into the ring. James realized something important during those quiet moments of reflection. He didn't need the fame or the recognition. What mattered most was how he handled the challenges in front of him. He had proven that he could face danger when it arose and handle himself with strength and control. But the most important thing he had learned was that true strength wasn't just about physical power. It was about how you used that strength, how you chose to act when faced with difficult decisions. He thought about the gang again, about the young men who had underestimated him. They had tried to intimidate him, thinking he was just a big guy who wouldn't fight back. But they didn't know who he really was. In the end, it wasn't his size or his past that made the difference. It was his ability to stay calm, to make quick decisions, and to act with purpose. He had chosen not to escalate things, to avoid violence as much as possible. And while he had defended himself, he hadn't let the situation define him. James smiled to himself as he thought back on the events. He hadn't wanted a fight. He didn't want trouble. But when it came down to it, he had stood his ground and handled the situation with grace. And that, in itself, was a victory. The experience had taught him more than just how to defend himself. It had reminded him of the importance of staying true to who you were, no matter the circumstances. James had never been just an MMA champion. He had been someone who valued peace, someone who wanted to make a difference without resorting to violence. He had worked hard to build a new life, and in that quiet life, he had found something that meant more than any championship ever could: a sense of inner peace. As time passed, James continued to live his life quietly. He spent his evenings reading books, working on small projects around the apartment, and enjoying the peace he had worked so hard to create. He didn't need the world to know who he was or what he had accomplished. He knew, deep down, that he had made the right choice to leave the world of fighting behind. He had found fulfillment in the simple things, in the everyday moments that most people took for granted. James didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The warrior inside him was still there, but now it was a quiet strength, a strength that came from within, from knowing that he could handle whatever life threw his way. And as he sat back and took a deep breath, he realized that he had already won, not in the way the world expected, but in a way that mattered more than anything else. He had found his peace, and that was the greatest victory of all.